So y'all thought y'all just got rid of me, but I got another interview. So we are going from Rwanda to Manchester, and it's the hottest day in Manchester right now. So you know they dealing with Young Boss Media. Monica Sekhmet Grant gonna make it hotter. I don't know if they know what's coming, but it's happening. Now on this episode of Mentorship Call, you know we have to bring to you so many different people of different diverse industries. Today, we're going to speak about the aviation industry. Now, we have with us Mr. Jon Howell. He is the founder and CEO of AviaDev Africa. And it's what he's doing. It seems very interesting, but I don't even want to speak too much on it because I feel like I'm going to mess some part of it up. But it's really cool, and it deals with planes and connectivity and bringing people together. And it's almost like a social aviation network. I don't know, maybe I'm describing that wrong. But Jon, welcome to the program. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Monica. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Now, please, I don't know if I did a great explanation for that or not. I might have destroyed it. But please tell us who you are. Give us a little bit about your background and tell us more about AviaDev Africa.
Sure, no problem at all. So Jon Howell, founder and CEO of AviaDev Africa. We set the business up about 5 years ago, but I've been working in the African market for about the last 8 years. Come from a family of people involved in aviation, and basically what's happening in Africa, what we take for granted in other parts of the world in terms of being able to jump on a plane and one stop go anywhere else in the US or anywhere else in Europe for a very small cost. It's just not possible in Africa. It's very expensive. It's very fragmented, poorly connected. So my mission really is to try and improve that connectivity within the African continent. The cities are growing. They need connectivity. The distances are too big. The only way to connect you until Mr. Musk builds his Hyperloop is airplanes. So there's so much potential, even in the current situation. It's going to require aviation to rebuild the industry. So yeah, that's basically what we do, or the premise of it. And in terms of actually what we do, I built this event from a bedroom here in my house, using social media, using LinkedIn, using Facebook, using WhatsApp, from the ground up 5 years ago as a non-African. Maybe it was an advantage, maybe it isn't. I don't know. Nobody gets to rerun it. And then I also run and set up the only podcast for African aviation. We've got 125 episodes of that in the can already. We have a YouTube channel. You know, we're trying to engage the next generation, and we do a lot of outreach activities as well. Whenever we're in Africa, we try and partner up, go to a school. We'll do paper airplane making competitions, inspirational talks, that kind of thing.
I love that. And you were saying before, you're friends with Derek. He's one of the pilots that we interviewed maybe about a month ago. And that was such a great conversation that we had.
Yeah, so Derek and I have worked together for probably 3 years. iFly is fantastic. We've done some events together in Cape Town and in Port Elizabeth, where he's based as well. So together, yeah, I mean, we just love what he's trying to do, and we're trying to do the same thing. And I think one of the big things that we're very much about is collaboration. So I see what Derek's doing and I go, hey, let's work together. And all too often in the whole world, too many people go, oh, they're doing what I want to do. Let's not collaborate. And we've become really good friends, and we've worked together on these programs. And he's doing a fantastic job, and of course he's the pilot. I wouldn't know what to do if you stick me in the flight deck, but he's pretty good.
That's awesome. We love Derek, and definitely love exposing young people to new opportunities. That is so important. Whether they choose it or not, just to know what's available is so important, and that's what we're all about. So you're not a pilot. Tell us, what is your background in aviation?
So my background actually comes from my family. So my dad, when he was 17, got offered an apprenticeship with British Airways back in the sort of 1960s. And he met my mum at the airport. She was working doing ground handling, check-in and boarding. And they told me all these stories, when we were growing up, about how easy it was to travel anywhere. When you worked at the airport, there wasn't the security issues. And on a Friday evening, they could just look at the departure board, pick a destination, get on a plane, hang out there for a couple of days, and then come back home and go straight back to work. Those were the days. That was how it worked. And obviously then as a child, because we worked in aviation, my parents worked in aviation, we didn't have loads of money, but one of the perks back then was you got flights, and people were you know, and we actually, the majority of my growing up, my dad was the manager here in the UK for Transworld Airlines, for TWA, if you remember them. So transatlantic flight. So we used to holiday in the US all the time because that was where the flights went. That's where we got the free flights. So yeah, he worked there. He worked for Turkish Airlines, and that kind of gave me this kind of. I knew I wanted to be in travel and tourism, but I didn't actually get into aviation till I was about 30. So about 8 years ago was when I first really got into aviation. I'd worked at the airport doing a few little jobs, but I'd actually lived abroad doing lots of tourism jobs. So I spent a year in New Zealand, a year in Australia, a year in Canada, 6 months in Greece, 6 months in France, and just doing seasonal work, you know, working in ski resorts or whatever would pay the bills, basically. And I loved it. And yeah, I've got the travel bug, love traveling, and aviation is definitely sort of in your blood, I think.
I love that. I love that. That's so amazing. And like your passion just behind that, like it's glowing off of you.
No, that's good. That's good.
Yeah,
That must be the sun that I had today. That must be the glow.
It's not, oh, aviation, you know, is what I do. No, like it exudes from you. Okay, so tell me, you're connecting people through aviation and you have a podcast. Explain how this works. And also, like, who is it for? Is it for the consumer, the client that flies, or is it for the pilots in the aviation industry?
No, great question. So there's basically two levels to this. So once a year, we host a live event. Okay, so this actually began, I think I was telling you, we began AviaDev in 2016. Our first event was in Kigali in Rwanda, and we stayed there for 2 years. And then we moved to Cape Town and we ran the event in Cape Town for 2 years. We were due to hold the event in Madagascar last month, but of course, COVID put pay to that. So we've postponed that to next year. Now, that event is very top level, invite only, business to business. So you get the CEOs of the airports, the CEOs of the airlines. Basically, they come together to have to pitch to each other their proposition. Hopefully that will lead to business. And then of course there's a conference alongside that and networking. So we do nice dinners and excursions to get people to know each other. So that's the main event, which is our kind of crescendo of the year. But what I decided to do, which is a little different to your average event organizer, is rather than wake up 3 or 4 months before an event or 3 or 4 weeks before an event, as some people do, I'm embedded in the industry through the year. So I go to all of the other events through this collaboration. I'll go to other people's events and support them. And what we've actually morphed into is kind of a media kind of agency. So when an aircraft is being delivered to a new customer, so we've got one going into Angola tomorrow, leaves Canada tomorrow.
Angola is so beautiful. I want to go there. I was looking at pictures and I was like, I never thought that Angola would be this beautiful. I want to go to Angola.
I've been to Angola. It's fantastic. Yeah, it's lovely. It's lovely. So, so they've got a new delivery of the plane. So, of course, the company that's making the plane, they want some coverage of that, and we work together. So I will help with that. But just to the big point for the people who are listening, and I understand that the concept of what you're trying to get is, when I began 5 years ago, access to information, there just wasn't any other than these events where they weren't digital. If you're not there, you don't know what happened. There was no recording. There was no interim conversation. So what I decided and made a real sort of core of what I do is, I need to get this information out on behalf of the African market. I want to help them get their message out, and I want to make that as accessible and as free as possible. So I started by blogging. So there's 100 odd blogs on LinkedIn that I've written. And then I pivoted to podcast. And as I say, I've been doing that for the last couple of years. And it's a fantastic way of obviously getting that information out to a young audience who like to consume podcasts. The US is probably my biggest audience, actually, you know, with the diaspora in the US. It's not surprising. But yeah, we make sure that it's basically accessible for everybody. And then we run at the live events. We actually do a ambassador program. So we'll invite people to submit a competition, and the winners actually get to present on stage. But they are all students or young people or trainee pilots, and they will actually get on stage and do it. And it's a great thing for them because then they can use that YouTube video in their sort of applications for jobs and things. So all of our sessions from our events are recorded, they're put onto YouTube, so young people can go on afterwards who couldn't afford to fly to Cape Town and spend the money. They can then just go on YouTube and they can watch the sessions back at their leisure, basically. So really important to me that we get people going from the ground up as much as from the top down.
For sure. So just to restate what you said, in the entrepreneurial spirit, there was already an established industry, something you knew about very well. Maybe you didn't work but you saw a gap. You saw a gap in services, and you said, you know what, I can build a lane here.
Spot on. Yes.
And you did the work, and you made it work for yourself.
Yeah, and the honest truth is, if we're going to get into that type of that element of the conversation, which is something I'm really passionate about, I'm not a purebred entrepreneur, but I'm definitely have some tendencies of entrepreneurship, and that's been tested through COVID, of course, as well. You have to pivot and you have to do different things. But look, what I've built is a business that sustains me, and I have one other person that works. We have a European event now as well, so we're doing 2 events, and we have a small team behind that. But it's not all the glitz and glamour and huge money. I just love it, and unfortunately or fortunately, the African market, and to pick up on this niche, there wasn't anybody being the voice of it, and I'm very cautious to say that, because actually I'm not the voice. What I do is I allow the voices to be brought forward. Yeah. So when we do a podcast, it's not about me, it's about my guest. I'm not African. It's not my job to do this, but I'm passionate to help Africa develop. And of course, my business and my interest is to see that. But the beauty of it is, when a new air route starts in Africa, you can see the impact, because you see that, it's so underdeveloped in terms of that those extra few flights a week start to fill those hotel beds. You see hotels being built, you see young people getting jobs. Whereas in the US or in Europe, a new route, so what? It's just another route, like we're already flying everywhere. You're so saturated that the impact you're making with helping create a new route, it's small. Whereas in Africa, it can be potentially massive.
Okay, so I was going to ask you, for a person that's watching this and saying, Monica, why is knowing when there's a new air route important? And so to speak about like entrepreneurship and planning ahead, if there's a new air route, you can plan for hotels and restaurants and entertainment and different things like that. Can you go a little deeper into that conversation?
Yeah, so it all starts. I mean, as I said, Africa, as we know, is massive. Okay, it's landlocked, and it doesn't have good alternative modes of transport. So to get around, unless you're prepared to sit on a bus for a long period of time, you're going to need to fly around. And of course, the kind of tourists, the kind of travelers that hoteliers, branded hoteliers, Hilton, Marriott, etc., that they are the ones that are going to fly in. So it all starts with airlift. Everything's tourism without airlift is almost impossible. You end up just with domestic tourism as much as anything else. It's something like, I know it's 52% of all tourists arrive at their destination by air. So if you think about how many, and this was obviously pre-COVID, and they're normally the ones that are spending more money because they're traveling further. It might be a trip of a lifetime, it might be a business trip, but either way, it's going to be higher yielding passengers that are going to be on those aeroplanes versus the people on the buses, as a general rule. So it's so vital. It basically, 1 in 10 jobs in the world is travel and tourism. It's very self-sustaining because you're not using something up. If you've got a tourist attraction, you manage it well. And just to give an example, like Rwanda with the gorillas, you have to manage it really, really well. And you can only have one group to go and visit the gorillas once a day for a certain amount of time. And that's why it's expensive, because there's only 1,000 mountain gorillas in the world. And I've done it twice. I'm a global ambassador for gorilla conservation as well. So I do fundraising here in the UK. I climbed the 3 highest mountains in the UK in one weekend wearing a gorilla suit a couple of years ago. So try and raise money. I ran a half marathon in Spain in last October in a gorilla suit as well. I was the only person in fancy dress. But you've got to raise awareness.
I need to see those pictures.
Oh yeah. I'll send you the pictures. No worries at all. But yeah, basically, it's kind of in the world we live in today. It does drive a lot. So these guys that want to build a hotel, they want to know what the airlines are going to do, because if they're not going to have a supply of good quality tourists or business people, they're not going to build a hotel, because there isn't going to be anybody to stay there. Even the airline crews, if they're coming in every single night and you've got 5-10 rooms every night guaranteed in your hotel, great, that's really good business to have, isn't it? Because so that's kind of the synergy, and once you get that new route, the trickle down catalytic effect is massive, right to the bottom of people who who want to just get into the business, into any part of the business. There are jobs created at all levels.
This is brilliant, Jon. That's very smart. It's a good place.
Need more. Yeah, we just need more.
I hear you. Are these routes? Is it only passenger, or does it include like cargo?
I only really focus on passenger commercial flights. So obviously you've got business aviation and you've got cargo. There are separate forums for cargo, but the honest truth is, which people don't often realize, some of these routes, when you're flying sat up the top, actually they're making a lot of money from the cargo that's in the hold. So they still carry cargo even though they're passenger planes. And what some of the airlines have been doing during COVID is they've actually been packing cargo onto the seats on passenger planes, because they can't carry passengers. So let's try and convert a passenger jet into a cargo jet, basically, because at least we can then use it and make some money, and we don't have to worry about the cargo giving the other cargo COVID. So it's not a problem.
True. Boxes won't spread to other boxes.
That's true.
While we're speaking about airlines still moving and surviving in COVID, I was reading about the South African Airlines is going through like a bankruptcy. How has COVID really shaped or changed the African airline industry?
The honest truth is we won't know for a while, because to give people out there, without going into too much detail, a bit of an overview. If you're sat in the US or in Europe, most of the airlines are privately owned. They're owned by shareholders, and they're privately owned enterprises. In Africa, it's very different. There are very few privately owned. Most of the airlines are owned by the governments. They are state-owned enterprises. So Kenya Airways, Ethiopian Airlines, South African, Egypt, they're all owned by the state. And what you've got there is you've got the problem we had is that we were entering COVID as the African market, losing money. The airlines in Africa were already losing money. They didn't need COVID because it was already not great. And the only airline that makes serious money is Ethiopian Airlines. But South African Airways has been losing money consistently for about 9 years. And of course, that money has to be topped up from the taxpayer, from the South African taxpayer. And there are some people saying we need an airline, and there are some people saying just let it go. We can't keep putting money in that we don't have. We need to spend it on healthcare, education, whatever. So it's a very emotive subject, and there are lots of reasons behind it. But the truth is, we won't know the full impact. IATA, so the Air Transport Association, International Air Transport Association, they've kind of said that Africa could be the worst hit out of all the regions, and it could lose half of the jobs in aviation, and that would just be devastating. And the losses could be in the almost around about $8 billion this year or something crazy. So just that at the end of the day, if you've got assets and you can't use them, you can't fly them, how can you? It's not their fault, but somebody's going to have to pay for this. So it might be that some of these airlines die. It might be some of them are resuscitated and given loans and guarantees. And it might be that as a result of this, it creates a little gap in the market, and somebody starts a fantastic new airline that makes money for everybody and everyone's happy.
So plain. So let's say COVID never happened before this, because you were saying that before COVID, there were struggling airlines already, but Ethiopian was doing well. What makes an airline do well versus not? Because to a regular person on the ground, you see planes flying, it just seems like it's doing well. I go to JFK Airport, I see people, looks like it's doing well. what determines if an airline is doing well or not?
Well, there's loads of different things, and different airlines. You can have very small airlines that are doing really well because they're serving really niche businesses. I mean, like any business. So there's airlines in Kenya, for example, that operate tiny little planes, but they make a fortune because they're flying people from Nairobi out to the camps for the safari. And these are people with money who are going on a trip of a lifetime, and they fly into a bush runway, and basically those airlines are doing really well, but they don't have any ambition to connect the world.
Right.
To give the example of Ethiopian, what you need if you're going to be a really successful commercial airline is you need scale. So they have 120 odd planes. So they've got the most planes in the African market. Then you need to connect lots of different places. And Ethiopian as an airline has been going nearly 75 years. So, it's a very slow growth. People don't realize that. And it's been sustained for 75 years. And basically, one of the things that people always point to with somebody like Ethiopian is, even though it's owned by the government, it's run by aviation professionals, not the government. And that's the problem, is sometimes in the African market, in history, and even today, the governments get too involved and they say we should fly from here to here because we have diplomatic relations, but there's no market. You're never going to fill the plane, or they're using the wrong plane on the wrong route and you're starting to lose money. So there's lots of different reasons. A big problem in Africa as well, and with some of the state-owned enterprises, is just the sheer number of staff. There are too many mouths to feed for the number of airlines. When you compare it to a private airline, it becomes like I don't know, just a kind of a, it just rolls on, and people just keep getting into new jobs, and it becomes like a bureaucratic kind of working for a council or any sort of state-owned enterprise. It can get quite bloated quite quickly in terms of the number of employees.
And so there's a massive loss happening, and we can't even tell how big of a loss it is right now. What was the question I was going to ask? Oh my goodness! I had a question.
No, that's all
right. Tell me, it'll come back. Tell me about your podcast. Who do you interview?
Yeah, so everyone and anyone to do with African aviation, to be honest. So we actually put one out this morning, which was fascinating, with a pilot from Malawi who also practices and teaches Reiki and meditation. And we talked about mental health in pilots and in aviation generally. So she's the governor of something called the 99s, which is the original Women Pilots Association globally, and it was founded by Amelia Earhart, who I'm sure people might know that name and Google it and find out exactly who she was. But she was an amazing person. So Derek's been on the podcast. We've had the CEO of Ethiopian Airlines. We've had CEOs of most of the African airlines have been on it at one point or other, and it's been a great access for me. And just talking generally about people getting into business. My point with podcasting is, don't worry about the audience, that will look after itself, but actually the access it gives you. And you'll know this as somebody who's done TV. If you've got a microphone in your hand, you're going to get that interview with that person. Whereas if you don't have that, then it's not gonna work. If you're kind of saying to them, I'm going to give you an opportunity. I've done 126 podcasts now for that particular one. And it's called AviaDev Africa. It's free wherever, and we've got an app on the App Store and Google Play. It's totally free, so please have a listen on Spotify, iTunes, whatever. Yes. And it's not going to be for everyone, because some of it's quite in depth and some of it. But I try and work out with, we try and do next generation stuff. We do current affairs, so some of it won't be relevant, because if it was recorded a year ago, talking about strategy, that's gone out the window, obviously, hasn't it? So,
we're going to bring everybody back.
Bring everybody back. But my advice to people out there is start the podcast, because then when you start to message people saying, hey, I'd really love for you to be a guest on my podcast. Normally they say, yeah, before they go, well, how many listeners have you got? And what's your distribution?
That's so true. Like I remember sending out messages to people like, you ain't never seen this show. You have no clue what it looks like, where it's going to be put, but you're saying yes.
Yep.
And so many people will say yes without even seeing it.
Yep. because they think that you're going to, ultimately you're going to do all the work for them and give them the exposure, and then they're just going to have to give you half an hour of their time, whatever it may be. And what that suddenly does is that opens opportunity. So let me give a great example. I interviewed the CEO of Ethiopian Airlines on board a plane at 30,000 feet. And it was the first flight. Ethiopian is the only African carrier that flies from Manchester to Ethiopia, to Africa, to be honest. And it was the first flight, and I was invited because obviously I live here and I work with them anyway. And we're on the plane. The CEO's in the business class bit. All of the media and all of the guests are sort of sat in the economy. And I know the country manager in the UK, whatever it may be. Anyway, once we had something to eat, he was ready for interviews, and I was the first person to get to interview the CEO, and BBC were waiting for me to finish before. And this was only episode 30 or whatever, but it was more about, I was actually I was very specific. I'm an African aviation podcast, whereas BBC is BBC. You know, it's very general. So my advice would be, go niche with your podcast and pick those people that you really want. Maybe not in the first 10 episodes, get yourself a body of work, but you'd be amazed. And at the end of the day, what's the worst they're going to do? They're just going to say no or ignore you. Right. So what, you know? So and you might catch them at another event, or you might catch them somewhere else, and it might be the right time. Actually, COVID's a great time, because a lot of these people are sitting around thinking, I don't have a full diary with flights here, there, and everywhere, and meetings and conferences. I've actually got a bit more time. So my advice to people out there, young people, is just get going. It costs nothing to start, and just go for it.
Absolutely. This is the generation of free resources. You just have to work them. Yeah. You have to do the work. You have to start when nobody believes in you, when nobody's telling you, hey, this is a great idea. Like, sometimes it's just your idea, and you have to figure it out along the way. It's not until you get to that 100th episode that's like, oh, maybe I should do this, or maybe I should do this different. But you can't predict that. Yeah. The only way to get there is to go through that process. And
close your eyes and ears until you've done 25 or 30 episodes. Look, don't get me wrong. Speak to your friends and family, trial it on them. Say, does this sound right? Even if they don't know the topic and the content, does it sound right? Does it sound professional? Does it sound good? Whatever it may be. And if you can invest in some equipment, I just use my earphones like this, but I am going to get like a proper microphone and stuff at some point soon. But you don't need it to make it work. And I think that there are too many people, I've seen it in not necessarily my own industry, but with people that have asked me about podcasts. They get very enthusiastic. They put 3 out. They think nobody's listening, and then they stop. And the truth is, you need to have a body of work before. Just ignore it. Do it. And if you do that, my thing would just be really harsh on this, would be, you're doing it for the wrong reason and you're in the wrong industry. I love doing them. It's a passionate. I love it. I love preparing for them and asking the questions and getting to know these people, and then sharing their story with the world. Maybe 100 people listen, maybe 1,000 people listen. Do you know what? I'm doing it for me as well, but actually it puts me in a very good position with other businesses and other individuals, because when I can drop the name and say, oh, would you like to be on my podcast? I recently interviewed the CEO of this airline, this airline, this airline. They're like, yeah, when can we do it? You know, so it gives me access that I wouldn't get normally. I go to Paris Air Show or Dubai Air Show, and suddenly you've got all these lanyards on saying VIP, because these guys know that, your media, and you're going to help them get the word out about whatever it is they're trying to promote or sell.
And also at this point, you have relationships, and that's what this builds as well. I think so. One, to be a TV personality, I've been able to build my company by doing these interviews and asking questions that are important to me. Like, how do you lead your team? How do you do this? Where did you get that grant from? Where did you get that money from? Did you get a bank loan, or was you doing something else? And really just asking questions over and over, and then being able to implement them into my business to where, like, now I have a very unique business, because I train people. I have producers, I have hosts. It's not just me. We have multiple shows, multiple programs, and then I have a nonprofit organization that does focus on the education piece. And a lot of this came from ideas, but also just ways to make it easier. And so if you're interviewing people within your niche and areas that you're really passionate about, if you're asking the right questions, and not just for the audience, but like you're coming from like a place of like, hey, as a normal person on the street, these are questions that I have, you'll start to be able to apply, you know, what you're learning to where you can build a successful podcasting company or aviation business that has the media arm, you know? But it goes out to like provide the media for who you want to speak to and ask the questions.
Yeah, and I think, you know, that people get hung up on, I have a podcast, the podcast needs to be sponsored. But I feel different. I feel like actually the podcast is the access to then get, you know, to get something from somebody later on. So to give an example, if I work with a plane manufacturer and we have a deal across the year, you know, they pay me a sponsorship, which culminates in having the live event, but then obviously also includes through the year, we'll do a podcast. That's part of the value. But actually what they don't, in a lot of these companies don't want, is to be a like overt sponsor where it says, you know, this podcast is brought to you by, I mean, what's the value of that? Versus actually kind of doing this in a more subtle way where you're interviewing them, but it sounds like, you know, I'm the one who's written to them to say, oh, can I interview you? As opposed to them just paying me to put that piece of news out. And we've all read it. You read it on the internet and in newspapers every single day, that it feels like it's just a press release. Nobody wants to read that. We've got so much information we can absorb in the world. Why would I want to read your press release? I don't.
No, but when you're a trusted face, a trusted voice, you know, it's like, all right, who does Jon say I should go to? Who does Jon trust? All right, cool. If Jon trusts them, I'm at least take my shot with them versus somebody else that I don't know.
Exactly. And I think, you know, that's taken me, as I alluded to earlier, just speaking honestly, you know, some people say, oh, because you're not from Africa, etc., that's helped you because of whatever reason. And some people say, actually, maybe that's hindered you. And I don't know the answer to that, you know, but it's all I would say is this is patience, the game of patience. And all these people who think that you're going to get something overnight, especially in this world now, it doesn't work like that, and that can't be your end goal. You have to have a slower pace, and ultimately it's about, you know, it's about what you dream of. You know, I love doing what I do, and so long as I've got a roof over my head and, you know, my family is okay, this is the dream life. I don't need the this, that, and the other, you know, and I get to travel around as well, which is fantastic, you know, when we can. So, you know, that is the key, is if you're going to start something like a podcast, or, you know, go into social media and say, I'm going to be the voice of X, that X has to be something you would do even if there was no money. So you can start that as a side hustle, which I know is a big thing, or and obviously then you don't have the pressure of trying to make money from it initially, but it could bloom into something over time if you're niche enough. You know, the old days of, if you wanted to be something in your local village, you had to be a hairdresser, a butcher, you know, whatever it was, because that was your universe. Whereas now you can be the most niche person. You can be selling, you know what, I've got my daughter's frozen karaoke machine. I don't know. You could be selling stuff like that, and there'd be loads of people that would want to talk about it and be passionate about it, because we're now talking to 8 billion people in the world as opposed to the people that live in our street. And that's the beauty of the thing about the exposure of the internet, means that you can go really narrow and then be a key, what we would call a key person of influence in that particular industry. And then you know what you are, you know what you're not. And that's the hard part. Stay in your lane as to what you are. Otherwise you end up getting distracted, and you know, then people think, oh, that Jon guy, I don't know whether he's Africa or he's Europe. So that's where I made a very conscious decision with my business when we launched in Europe to bring in somebody else who was going to be Mr. Europe, because I couldn't be both. It just doesn't make sense. It's a very different market. So I've got a guy who I've trained up, who I've hopefully given some of the skills to. So he's now doing what I'm doing, but for a different market. And that is for me, has worked really nicely.
So Young Boss Media was founded here in New York, but I've been to West Africa before in college. And so I always knew that I wanted to return into be of service, but also be an entrepreneur, you know, because when I went before, I went to Senegal and Mauritania, and then I went back to Ghana, and I just saw how money rolled through my hands like water. And it was like, well, in order to stay here, I have to have some type of economic system for myself. So when I launched Young Boss Media, I knew that I wanted to be able to be on the continent and teach people how to use, how to do what we're talking about right now, how to create media with the resources that they have, with the budgets that they have, and really play the long game in the media and build up their business. And so that's one thing that I wanted to offer to the continent. And so when I met Raphael, you know, I was like, yo, I have this idea for Young Boss Africa. I got to get on the ground and do this and that, you know, and he telling me about his aviation background. And so at this point, we don't know when we're going to fly, but it's like, hey, we can start talking to people. And so he's my Young Boss Africa, you know, and then also like just but like by this interview with Derek and just interview with so many other people, utilizing Zoom or StreamYard to still have the same conversation, still put out the same message, you know, being flexible in a time of a global pandemic doesn't mean we're not going to actually be productive. I'm actually more productive now had I just went to Senegal and interviewed a few people and then came home. Now I can hit the whole continent. I'm in Europe right now. I just came from Rwanda. I was in Kenya the other day. You know, I can do so much more during this time, you know, and who would have thunk it?
No, it is amazing. I mean, the big challenge obviously in Africa is the cost of internet and the availability of it and the reliability of it. It's very high compared to people's earnings and compared to other parts of the world. So that's definitely an impediment, but I know there's satellites being launched and there's initiatives going on to improve that. And, you know, the one thing that I am never cease to be amazed by in Africa is the entrepreneurial spirit that you just see in every single person, born out of necessity quite often. But, you know, I've been to Lagos and there's these guys running 100-meter Usain Bolt speeds to keep up with you at the window because they want to sell you a bottle of water and you're in traffic and they move with the traffic. I mean, it's the most dangerous job in the world to sell a bottle of water. But they've adapted, you know, to that market. I mean, this is from Ghana. This is an artist I work with in Ghana. So that's from Ghana as well. I've got lots of great friends in Ghana. I love it there. I mean, Ghana, Nigeria, because it's English speaking, obviously it's a bit easier for me to sort of get things done there than it would be in the Francophone countries. But that's the amazing part for me is, you know, obviously I'm also my host. So I'm working a lot with Madagascar at the moment. It's a very different feel and just an incredible place, but it offers so much different. And when people ask me about, well, what's Africa like? Oh, come on, guys. Like, you know, Ghana's so different to Nigeria is so different. It for some reason, people who don't know talk about Africa, you know, and there's just so much variety. And that's the point. I want people to be able to see it. And I want people to have the opportunities that everybody else has had. And I think that, you know, this is the century for Africa to really develop. But it needs to diversify. You know, countries like DRC, like Angola, they've been so reliant on getting the minerals or the oil out of the ground and getting it out, and that's their economy. Well, that money that comes back in then needs to support, like you said, Angola needs to now support a tourism industry because that will sustain whether there's oil or not. It needs to diversify its economy, and same with Nigeria. It's just not done it well enough. But if somebody comes along and is able to do that, it's going to make a heck of a difference to the continent. And you know, I'm very positive about it, but we're obviously all going through a massive period of pain right now.
For sure. Now, a big part of this call, particularly with anybody dealing with any African nation, is that there's African Americans, Africans of the diaspora that want to do business on the continent. And so I'm asking everybody, what have you seen working? What industries? If I have a little bit of money, it's a little bit of money, and I want to invest it in Africa, what should I be doing? What areas should I be looking at right now?
Well, I've got some friends that are working in, like, you know, from my industry in drones, delivery drones. You know, there's so many applications of drones. So you just on with Rwanda, they were the first place in the world to deliver blood by drone. So they have a US company called Zipline, and it has an airport type thing, and these drones take off And of course, they can deliver blood to really remote parts of the country. And they've
Mm.
been operating for a few years, no problems, you know, touch wood that there aren't any. But I would say, you know, that kind of technology, you know, drone technology and the application of that, a lot of people are thinking, oh, this could be a good place to trial it in Africa for different reasons. So, you know, I think that's definitely an interesting market. But as I say, you know, there are entrepreneurs, the entrepreneurial spirit is built in. So no matter what industry you want, there will be good people and there'll be not so good people. And it's about finding those people and working with them. And, you know, that only comes from actually going to visit. So that would be probably my biggest piece of advice is you've got to go and spend time there. And I deal with international companies who come to me and say, right, we're a big company, we do really well, we want to get into Africa, help us. And I go, okay, come with me.
Yeah.
Or come to my event, you know. And they're like, oh, well, and you just say, well, if you're not prepared to do that, I can't help you, because Africa is like most places in the world, we're human beings. It relies on relationships, it relies on exchange of knowledge and expertise, and it's you know, it's full, it's everywhere. Entrepreneurship, you just open your eyes when you get to Africa, you will see it from the person on the street all the way through to the other end. So you'll find good people. I've got no doubt about that.
Awesome. Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. You have to be there to experience just the vibe, because I don't know, at least for me, I know if I walk into another neighborhood, I'm noticing different things, you know? And so depending on where you come from, wherever you are, you're going to have a different lens on possibilities. So, you know, it's worth that trip. And so the question that I had that I forgot, the big question is, what are they saying about flying into different countries? Like, when are the gates being opening up?
As it is for the whole world, there isn't a unilateral approach to this. It's not like everybody's getting together. What's happened is everything's fragmented. So, you know, Tanzania, for example, are already open. They've been open for a couple of weeks, and they've just said, whatever, let's just get on with it. Tourists are welcome, and the flights can start. But, you know, Kenya is still, there are no international flights. South Africa, the same. You know, one thing I would say is that because Africa was one of the last places to actually get the virus, they acted a lot faster to shut down than other parts of the world, for the simple reason that they'd seen either mistakes that have been made or what could happen if you don't do it really quickly. So it was very draconian, very quick in South Africa. I mean, I did some work with the government down there, and it was literally, you know, there's curfew, you can't buy alcohol and cigarettes. I'm not sure what that's got to do with COVID, but, you know, they shut down the shops and everything was kind of closed down. And they were, you know, took it very seriously, and they've done a great job in terms of the numbers of people dying. But of course, you've got this horrendous trade-off between lives and livelihoods. You know, we want to save lives, but how many livelihoods are going down every single day? How many people are really struggling as a result? And that's a horrible decision to make. Nobody ever says that a life is not worth taking that risk, but at some point, you know, you've got to do something. So the truth is, we don't know when the doors are going to open. I would expect some, you know, there's domestic flights in Ghana have been going for a month or so. They were the first country really to start to open up there. But of course, then when they want to go to another regional destination, they have to adhere to the rules of Nigeria, for example. So Nigeria is not open, so you can't now fly from X to Y. So everybody's going at a different rate depending on how they were affected and how they've reacted to the disease. What I'm hoping, so long as we don't get a second spike, is that international travel will probably start to come back in the late third quarter of this year, so that early next year it's going to be not business as usual, but there'll be a lot more routes operating and people will feel confident. But of course, the caveat to this is if somebody comes up with a vaccine tomorrow that can be replicated to 8 billion people across the world, we'll be back to normal a lot quicker. If we feel safe in our environment, we'll go back to normal a lot quicker than what we're dealing with.
Do you trust vaccines?
Oh, good question. Right. I suppose so. Yeah, I don't know. I suppose so. But good. I guess maybe you don't from the tone of voice.
You know what? I think when before COVID, I was planning on being in Senegal for the summer, and so I knew like I needed to get my yellow fever shot updated. So I had no problem with that. But when I think of a COVID-19 vaccine, it's like, oh, it's too soon. Hold on. I don't even know where that thing came from. Like, you gotta test that out first.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm not a doctor. I don't know. There's part of what they're saying in the UK is they're hoping that the virus, every time it's passed on, it's mutating and becoming less dangerous. So it will kind of work its way. Its potency will reduce. But you hear that one day, and then the next day you see the numbers. We have the worst numbers in Europe in terms of deaths, with nearly 45,000 people dead here in the UK, which is horrendous. Man. It's absolutely horrendous. But and things are starting to open up here.
Yeah.
But even here, if you fly into the UK today, you have to quarantine for 2 weeks. So who would do that? Would I go on a trip to Dubai? So when I come back, I have to stay for 2 weeks. Nobody's going to travel. Nobody's going to go on holiday or business while you've got those quarantine measures in place, unless they're desperate to see family and friends, or there's some particular business thing. Unless you're absolutely desperate, you're not going to choose to do that.
Correct. Yeah. Interesting times.
Sure
that we're in. Jon, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate what you're doing and teaching us about what you're doing in the aviation world. I think it's very unique, but also like good for you. Like you found a lane for yourself and you're doing your thing. So like that's a young boss move. So
I appreciate it, Monica. So if anybody wants to connect, I'm on LinkedIn. If you want to have a listen to the podcast, it's AviaDev Africa. Just that's probably the best way. I'm pretty active on LinkedIn and Facebook and stuff. So, find us on there. And, I've been talking to Raphael, so we'll keep in touch with him as well and try and help him out. So, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. I'll be listening to your podcast. Take care.
Awesome. Take care. Cheers, Monica.
Peace.
Bye.